Gracias. My Spanish isn't good enough for me to present to you in Spanish, but I will present in English. As you just heard, I'm a lawyer based in the United States. I have had, or I have worked with open source software developers and open source lawyers for probably 25 years. And I'm going to talk a little bit about the legal mechanisms that we use to create open source, the licenses, and a new way of thinking about how to understand how they relate to one another. I call it a knot because it's actually quite complicated, and for a lot of people it's somewhat difficult to understand. So I think most of you may be aware of the Open Source Initiative, and we will have several speakers after me from the Open Source Initiative or who work with the Open Source Initiative to talk about various things that they do. The Open Source Initiative is an organization that was set up 30 years ago to try to determine what is open source software using the licenses that are attached to them as the measurement of what is and isn't open source. It's been around a long time. It's got a very active community around it to talk about licenses. I'm a very active participant in that community. But one of the things you will see if you go to the Open Source Initiative website, which I've linked to here, is they have over 100 different open source licenses listed on their website. Okay, I got to talk louder. Usually you don't tell people from the United States they have to be louder, but I will do that. On the Open Source Initiative website, there are over 100 licenses. And for many people, when they see that, it causes a degree of concern. It's very difficult to navigate or understand how one should decide whether to pick a license or what the differences are between the various licenses. Now, one of the things the Open Source Initiative did many years ago, and I was part of this initiative, this was 15 years or so ago, is they did a degree of categorization of the licenses they have. So if you look here, they've got a total of 100 licenses on their website. They do have a category that's intended to include the most popular or the best licenses, or the ones that are most used by people. There's only 13 listed licenses there, which is a much more manageable number than 100. But for many people, still, it's a little bit too much to digest, and it doesn't give you any additional information about what the differences are between these licenses, why one would want to pick one over the other. So I've always felt that that was a bit of a problem, that there needed to be more information conveyed, or people needed to be better able to understand these licenses and what they meant for software they were using, or when they were developing software, which one of these licenses they should pick. So I've been involved in a personal project, for the past year and a half of taking all 100+ licenses, reading through them, and trying to understand the relationships between the various licenses to one another. And what I've found is that a lot of these licenses are very similar in many ways. And for those of you, I'm sure you're probably familiar, there are two old licenses, the BSD license and the MIT license, typically used for non-copyleft open source software. There are many, many different variations of these licenses, some very insignificant variations, some have some important differences. But what you find when you review this entire list is that what you've got is a lot of different variations of sort of the same thing. Many of these licenses really are just modified versions of some other license. So it's not that you've actually got 100 completely unique open source licenses out there. What you've got is a series of families of licenses, some of which may have many different variants, significant or insignificant variations of a single license. So what you find is you can actually come up with interesting groupings of these licenses based on sort of their family heritage. Many of the differences are very small, some are somewhat big, but in the end they all are part of a similar family. Now this is something that the OSI categories don't really explain. And so it's sort of been my idea or my project over the past year and a half or so to see if there was a better way to understand how these licenses related to one another and how they were the same or different. So what I did was I came up with a different schema, a different plan for looking at all of these licenses and how they may or may not relate to one another. And what I've done is I've taken a license which I call the base license, and I've said, okay, I'm going to use this license or this version of the license, and then I'm going to use that as the basis for a comparison with other licenses that I think are similar. How I went about making that decision of what was the base license is a little bit unique to me. It was kind of based on my own experience of what people tend to use when they're picking a license and the ones that I think are best example of a family of licenses. So it's somewhat unique to me. Different people may have different ideas of what should be the base license of a family. What I've done is I have taken a base license and then I've gone through and done comparisons with all the licenses or many of the licenses that I can identify that I think are variations of that license. And what I've done is I've created 4 categories of variance between a base license and other licenses in the family. They are additive, so that would be a license that takes the base license and adds new legal requirements. Subtractive licenses, so licenses that take the base license and take away or remove requirements of the base license. Concatenative licenses, and that's there are a number of examples of licenses that take 2 licenses and sort of put them together or assemble them together into a single license. And then what I call nominative licenses, and that's a license that looks a lot like another license but uses the name of the software project or the creator of the software. So rather than saying, say for example, this code is licensed by the authors of the software, it'll say this code is licensed by XYZ Corporation, something like that. So that's a license that actually names a creator rather than being generic to anybody who wants to use the license and creates using it. Okay, so those are the 4 categories I came up with as part of this project. And here's an example of what I've been doing with these licenses. So I will take the text of what I've considered the base license. So in this case, it's the BSD 3-clause license. And I've done a comparison match between the two. You can see the differences in the yellow text here. And that's where the Apache 1.1 license differs in text from the BSD 3-clause license. And then what I've done here is I've highlighted using the boxes where these variations or these variants apply to this particular comparison. So in some cases in the green boxes, what they've done is just changed the name to be specific to the Apache Software Foundation rather than just the authors or the copyright holders. And then I've also in the blue boxes circled or put a box around the parts that add new requirements to the basic requirements of the BSD3 clause. So the conclusion here when you do this sort of analysis is that the Apache 1.1 license is essentially the BSD 3 clause license with some things added and with the specific name of the Apache Software Foundation inserted in certain places to make it specific to them. Here's another example, the MIT license. I've compared a license called the unlicensed to MIT. Now in this case, you know, in black there, which is where there is no difference, it's a pretty small part of the license, but it does replicate that part of the MIT license, and then it adds at the top a lot of additional text beyond MIT. Some of that is additive, so they've added new requirements to what's in the MIT. And some of that is subtractive. They've actually taken out parts of the MIT license from the text. So this is a license that is MIT that is both additive and subtractive using my variant categories. Okay, so I've now been looking at this through lots and lots of different licenses. And what you find is you can sort of map out a family tree of some of these licenses, where you take the base license and you see that there are a large number or at least a number of different licenses that have these variant categories applied to them. So if you take the BSD3 clause license here, if you look, the root branches or the brown branches are the licenses that subtract from the terms of the BSD3 clause. The green branches are licenses that add provisions or language to the BSD3 clause. And in some cases, the left-hand branches are ones that also change the name that is used, so those are nominative as well. The ones on the right-hand green are ones that don't change the name, but do add language. And then what you find there is you've got some licenses that both add and subtract, so they will have a green and a brown branch to them. And you also have a couple of licenses that are a combination of the BSD3 clause plus the MIT license, which may or may not also add or subtract from that text. So anyway, I'm still working on a way to assemble all of this together in a coherent way to show a giant family tree of all the licenses, but this is one way to look at it, is these are all branches of a tree that come from the BSD3 clause, and in that way you can understand that there are many, many licenses that are essentially part of that family. Here's another one where I've taken the MIT license and done the exact same family tree mapping. So I've got MIT is the base license. There's a bunch of licenses that add, so those are in the green. There are other licenses that subtract from MIT. Those are in the brown. There's a couple of licenses that both add and subtract from MIT. Those are the ones that have both brown and green branches to them. And there are also licenses that combine MIT with another license, in this case the BSD3 clause, which in the previous slide the same licenses. So there's two licenses that are a combination of those two licenses. Okay, so why am I doing this? It's a good question. Other than I'm an obsessive or this is kind of what I do for a living. I want to be able to help people understand that when you first look at the list of all these licenses and you see there are over 100, the initial reaction is, oh my gosh, this is way too much information. It's too complicated. How do I even deal with this? And this is a problem. I know developers have this problem a lot. If you are looking at a piece of software that comes in under a license that you don't recognize, sometimes you sort of throw your hands up in the air and don't know what to make of it. It's also a problem for lawyers, and we read licenses for a living. When you look at the 100 licenses and you say, how am I going to get a grip on what this particular license that I have in front of me that I've never seen, what does that mean, and how do I relate it to what I do know? I think this is maybe a good way for people to better understand licenses and how they may relate to licenses that they are familiar with. So if you have a general understanding of a handful of the most important licenses, BSD, MIT, GPL, Apache, maybe Mozilla, if you have this sort of analysis, it helps you understand better when you get a variant of that license, what it means compared to the licenses that you know. So most people are familiar with the base licenses, or are at least able to access resources that describe to them what the base licenses are. This is a way to allow you to use that knowledge to understand licenses that may be a little bit different or ones that are not commonly used. So for example, in the example here, there's a ZPL 2.1 license. Probably most of you have never seen that license. I run up on it occasionally, but I read a lot of SBOMs, so I see all these variants of licenses. But if you know that the ZPL 2.1 license is just the BSD 3 clause license with 2 additional added legal requirements, a lot easier to understand the thing and process and understand what you want to do with it. All right. So a little bit about the schema that I'm using here. What is the base license that is chosen will change the analysis. So if I had chosen BSD 2 clause or BSD 0 rather than BSD 3 clause, what would be additive or subtractive would be completely different. So the schema that I'm using here is kind of based on my own experience. I hope it is useful. If people want to do their own variations of this, they're welcome to. But for me, this is the best way for me as somebody who reads a lot of these licenses to understand how they all relate to one another. Similarly, the variant categories I've come up with are somewhat subjective. So for example, what is subtractive? I tend to look at something as being subtractive if it's taken away something that has a legal effect. So if, let's say, they change a word that really doesn't change the meaning of the license, I don't consider that to be a subtraction. If they add some statements in there that really don't have any legal effect, that's not really additive to me. But again, this is my own opinion about these things. Other people may have different opinions upon them. Or your lawyer may have a different opinion if you have one. Now, a little bit about the analysis that I've been doing. I'm not done with this. Obviously, 100 licenses, doing comparisons between all of them or lots of them with one another takes a lot of time. I have a regular job. Nobody's paying me to do this. So this is sort of a long-term project of mine that I've been doing as a mechanism to help myself and hopefully help others when they're trying to understand these licenses. It's a hobby of mine. I've got others, but this is one that I do sort of in the time that I have where nobody's paying me to work. So one of the things that I've done is I've put together a spreadsheet, a LibreOffice spreadsheet with all of the data that I've been collecting. And so what I've done is I've included the name of all the licenses that are on the OSI website. So all 100 plus licenses the OSI has done. I put them in the spreadsheet on the left-hand side. I've put tick marks on the ones that I've got a copy uploaded at GitHub, and tick marks on the ones that I've done a comparison of. I'm using the SPDX identification for these licenses. For those of you who are not familiar, SPDX is a nomenclature that's very commonly used for identifying licenses, especially in SBOMs and README statements. I use that because I think most people are familiar with that. I list the category that the OSI assigns the license, and then the family that, according to my analysis, the license belongs into, and the modifiers. It's subtractive, additive, nominative, concatenative. So as you can see, the ones in greens are the ones that I've done. The ones in white are the ones I'm still working on. This is a fairly lengthy spreadsheet that I've got, and where you will find this is on GitHub. So I have a GitHub repo. It's under my name, McCoy Smith, easy to remember. And I've got a sub project in there called OSI license categories, where I have been repositing all the licenses as I go through the analysis. So I will take a license, as you can see, the first entry, 0 BSD, compare BSD3 clause. So what I've done there is I've taken the BSD3 clause, I've done a comparison with the 0 BSD license in the format that I showed in the previous slide, where you can see the differences and the similarities between the base license and the compared license to see how they differ. That's an easy way for anybody, either a developer or a lawyer, to just click on that and say, okay, I'm looking here, this is 0 BSD, I can see what has been removed from BSD3 clause, I can see what has been added beyond BSD3 clause. That helps me better understand what this license is about compared to a license that I'm familiar with. So anyway, open GitHub repository, anybody can go look into it, anybody can go add to it if they want to, although I tend to be the only person that's doing this right now. But if you ever come to a situation where you're trying to understand a particular license, or you have a lawyer who's trying to understand a particular license, and they're not familiar with it, or you're not familiar with it, you might want to look in here, because there may be a comparison that I've uploaded that might be helpful to you or your lawyer when they are confronting these questions. Okay, so that's all I've got for now. This is my project. It's a work in progress. Take a look at it if you're interested. Send your lawyer to it if they're interested. Otherwise, I'm open for questions, and I've been here down here for 2 weeks and had a great time in Argentina. There's some pictures of the stuff that I've been doing. So thank you very much for your time.
Thank you, McCoy. Awesome. Preguntas? Questions? Come on, people, don't be shy. Merry Christmas.
Hi, thank you for your talk. I was wondering if you have given any thought to automating this information or working with developers so that, because for example, the Creative Commons organization has a tool where you can like navigate licenses, and the information you're producing is so valuable, I think.
Yeah, you know, it's an interesting question. There has been, I mean, Creative Commons has done that, and there has been discussions for many, many years about using a license wizard or a license chooser, and I think actually there are a couple of them out there. They're not particularly good. This is something that at some point might be useful to do something like that. You know, I'm not sure I have the time to create one, but you know, if some large multi-billion-dollar company is willing to do it for me or throw some money my way for me to do it, I'm more than happy to take it.
Okay. Julia, all the speakers are doing the question.
Hey, McCoy. Thanks for your presentation. I have one kind of curiosity. Why did you choose the CCO license for your repository? That's one. And the other is legal consultancy, if that's possible. Is it right to say that only the owner of only the author of the, I don't know if it's the author of the license, but only the author of the project can enforce the license and nobody else? Yeah, thank you.
Yeah, those are some good questions. Why did I choose CC0? I'm a big believer in zero licensing or public domain stuff.
Okay.
Copyleft and even permissive licenses that have attribution requirements can be a bit of a headache. I advise people on them all the time. I don't want anybody to be burdened by that. So it's in the public domain. You can do whatever you want with it. You don't have to credit me. You can take all the credit you want. I don't care. Can the author of a project, is the author of a project the only entity that can enforce the license? That's a very timely question because there is a lawsuit right now in the United States, the Software Freedom Conservancy versus Vizio, that is testing that proposition, at least under California state law in the United States. We don't know the answer to that yet. I'm monitoring the case, and it probably does not go to trial, if it goes to trial at all, until early next year. So we may know the answer to that question, but right now, I don't know that there's any country in the world or state within a country that has ruled that anybody other than the copyright holders are allowed to enforce the license. But that may change.
Another question?
Hi, thank you for your work. It's great. So I have a question related to the general state of the open source world, because I'm sure you know there are a lot of companies that are kind of changing the rules. Terraform comes to mind, but there are a lot. Do you think there is a trend to be not so open in a lot of companies, and how is that evolving?
Yes, there is a trend of a lot of companies switching from open source to something that's not really open source, although they try and say it's open source. What do they call it? Source available or whatever.
Open core.
Open core. I mean, open core is a little different, but source available, the SSPL, all of those. That is a trend. Whether it will continue is a good question. I've seen some companies switch back. They tried to do the source available. They decided that wasn't working, so they switched back to the open source. Usually it's multiple licenses. So it's open source, source available, and proprietary license. These are trends that are happening. Where it will all go, I don't know, but it's worth keeping your eye on because many companies are exploring this.
Can you give us your perspective on the applicability of open source licenses to AI technologies? What are the risks? What are the gaps?
So there's a presenter coming on a little bit later that's going to talk about that. The OSI has had an initiative for a couple of years, or at least a year, to try and come up with a definition of what open source AI is, and I think they're going to present that here. It was published within the past couple of months to lots of discussion. It's an interesting question, and what stands behind it is what really has to be open in a open AI system. And I think we're going to have a lot of debates about that, especially on the ingestion end and the output end. I mean, I think generally the system itself being open source is something that most people understand because that looks like a piece of software that we're used to in the open source world. Question is the data that you use to train that, does that have to be open, or how open does it have to be? And the same, is the output something that has to be open? Now, I know in the open source world, we know of many pieces of open source software that produce outputs that don't have to be open source, compilers, for example. But that's part of the question that is being thought through and asked, and I'm sure we'll have a robust debate about that a little bit later today.
Okay, thank you all. Thank you, McCoy. We have the time up. So big applause for McCoy.